It's very instructive. He says, based on my reservations about some of the aspects of the documentary hypothesis, some might find it hard to believe that I actually do believe the hypothesis. But here's why, and I want you to notice this. Here's why he does believe in the documentary hypothesis. He says it is because of his belief in the Book of Mormon that gives him the reason to believe in the documentary hypothesis. I thought this was interesting. The Book of Mormon explicitly reflects a very similar process. The redaction by Mormon and his son Moroni of multiple documentary sources. This includes the large plates of Nephi, the small plates of Nephi, incorporated in total, the record of Zenith, the record of Alma, various letters, and the Jaredite record on the 24 gold plates. This process of having multiple sources and a later redactor putting them all together into a book is precisely the documentary hypothesis, and it is exactly what we find in the Book of Mormon. So the Bible origin is very similar to the Book of Mormon. So I thought that was very interesting. And then he goes through the various evidences of the documentary hypothesis, and they are enormous. And he talks about more of the Joseph Smith translation, which is extremely interesting, how he ties in several of the documentary hypothesis ideas in the patriarchs with the Joseph Smith translation. Oh, and then I'm going to continue on with this too. On page 96 of his article, were multiple sanctuaries permitted? Now, see, this is one of the big criticisms. Then he brings out the first critic, Alexander Campbell. He says God's house was only held at Jerusalem, of course. So Nephi building a temple in the New World was completely inappropriate. No true Jew would act that way and behave that way. There were no multiple sanctuaries. But understanding the documentary hypothesis, let alone the actual archaeological and historical findings at Elephantine, among others, and Arad, various sources show that the Jews and Israelites built multiple sanctuaries. The first commandment of the Deuteronomic law code, this is the D source, says to sacrifice to God in only a single place. This principle applied to the temple in Jerusalem, which became a significant feature of the religious reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah, and this is part of why Brent Gardner says Lehi and Nephi probably did not totally concur with Josiah, because they would have been in the north. Their land of inheritance was up in the Ephraim-Manasseh area, and they had their altars and sanctuaries to sacrifice to. Not just in Jerusalem, but wherever they could. This is beautiful in the documentary hypothesis. This centralization law seems, however, to have been a religious innovation, because there's no evidence that this was an ancient Israelite law. Now this is interesting. Barney, typical of Barney, he brings in so much, he's so good with details with the Hebrew Bible. He's another very good Hebraist. Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon. And now there's four very prominent biblical personalities here that he's bringing out. These four all sacrificed at various altars, and none of them were reproached about it. Isn't that fascinating? The sources varied with respect to issues such as centralization of sacrifices, and this can be illustrated by references made to the tabernacle. The tabernacle is mentioned 3 times in E, but never in J or D, but over 200 times in the P source. So, critics of a fundamentalist bent presume the Bible speaks with one voice on the required centrality of worship in Jerusalem. It does not. Given that Lehi was of the tribe of Manasseh, that his family comes from the north, and that there may be a special prominence of E among the brass plates, it's not surprising at all that Lehi and his family did not accept the centralization of sacrifice at the southern site of the temple at Jerusalem. That's very interesting. And also the idea of non-Aaronic priesthood offerings being permitted. Once again, by what authority does Lehi offer sacrifices? You see, where does this priesthood come from? I've done a video or two on this already, but from the documentary source hypothesis, we can see this yet again in another good, new, interesting light. Other sources differed from P about this idea. In P, only the sons of Aaron are priests, and the other Levites are low-level helpers, while in the other sources, all Levites could be priests. Beyond that, Jeroboam in the north appointed non-Levite priests at Bethel. The Old Testament records numerous non-Levitical offerings. Gideon and Samuel were Ephraimites. Saul was a Benjaminite. David and Solomon were of Judah. So the idea is the different sources had different understandings of who could offer offerings and sacrifices. Lehi, coming from the north, did not accept the southern J source's views. It accepted the E northern source, and hence Lehi offered sacrifices on an altar. An altar of stone, incidentally, not a stone altar, an altar of stone, reflecting beautiful Hebraic usages. Just want you to know that. Lehi's sacrifice would have been anathema from the perspective of the P source, of course, but that's not the perspective Lehi came from. From the perspective of a northern source, it was perfectly appropriate. I think that's fascinating how the documentary hypothesis gives us inside information like that. Okay, now Brandt and his commentary, Volume 1, Second Witness. I'm on page 132, 133, 134. I'm going to skip the idea of his analysis of brass, things like that. The idea of the brass plates being some form of Egyptian script is verified by the biblosyllabic texts, as Bill Hamblin has so aptly shown, and I've actually made a video using Hamblin's outstanding research on this principle of Reformed Egyptian in my Book of Mormon Evidences videos. The biblosyllabic texts preceded the Book of Mormon, so there is historical precedent for this idea of Egyptian writings being on metal plates and being a combination of Egyptian and Hebrew. And Hamblin has brought out several other artifacts from the Phoenician coast and different types of writings, the Canaanite alphabet, and the mixture of Egyptian hieroglyphics with Canaanitish, Phoenician, Syro-Palestinian, Hebraic writings. In really good studies. You can actually access Hamblin's material on the farm's website. I would strongly encourage you to. I know he watches my videos, so I probably shouldn't say this about him because it'll swell his already fat head. Sorry, Bill, I can't help it. But anything you can read by Dr. Hamblin is worth its weight in gold. No pun intended. Gold plates, you know. Yeah. Dr. Hamblin has done some outstanding research in these areas. And Brandt is right to acknowledge that. Now, and I'm not going to get on to the history of the gold plate or the brass plates. Well, I did want to cover this, though. There are three textual traditions for our Old Testament. The Masoretic text. This supplies the base text for the King James Version of the Old Testament. Now, the Greek Septuagint of the Old Testament was translated into the Greek for the Jews in the diaspora, that is, and this is the oldest version, that is around Alexander the Great's day, 300 BC. This text differs in some places from the Masoretic text, and then, of course, we have the Qumran Library, the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls text, the third tradition, and there are alternative parallel manuscript traditions that do not completely agree with each other in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and comparing the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Septuagint, with the Masoretic text. It's wonderful. I will have a chance to do that with some of the Book of Mormon quotations of Isaiah, and some of Alma's quotations, and some of Abinadi's quotations of Isaiah. So there's some fun stuff coming up in this Book of Mormon commentary.